Welcome to the global interview series on hydrogen, where we slice through the hype to ask the all-important question of what's next for hydrogen, which many are calling the oil of the 21st century. Very glad to have 𝗚𝗏𝗏𝗏, an managing partner at 𝗥𝗲𝗹𝗆𝗆 Partners, with us today. He has a special focus on EMEA. Welcome.
Hi, Michelle.
Thank you very much for joining us. Let's start off with price expectations when it comes to hydrogen. So 30, as part of the HyDeal Ambition project, 30 European energy players have launched an integrated value chain product intended to deliver green hydrogen across Europe at 1.5 euros per kilo by 2030. That's a very short 9 years away. How realistic do you think this deal is?
Look, we have to believe that it's realistic, and actually volumes are quite important to make that price point realistic. Location is also very important. So being in locations benefiting from abundant and affordable green electricity, but also not being far from consumption points and having efficient and ideally low-cost transport options to those consumption points will be very important in achieving that. Obviously, those companies do believe that that is within sight. I mean, we've done a fair bit of number crunching around that, and clearly, if we didn't believe it was within sight, we wouldn't be mobilizing so wholesomely around that. But indeed, as I mentioned, I think the key ingredients are cheap electricity, efficient transport, but also upscaling the size of the current electrolyzers available in the market, but also with higher volume production, bringing their price points down.
And getting the economies of scales for the electrolyzers and also bringing down that cost of transport are two major sticking points with this conversation. And as you say, that this goal is set in stone, and everything's chugging towards it. But how to get over those? What are where the devil is in the details? What's needed to bring down those costs?
Look, electrolysis is a well understood, well proven technology. It's currently used in much more challenging contexts in the chemical industry. Indeed, it's a matter of gaining the economies of scale, and several gigafactories are either being planned or being implemented already in Europe and North America, and hopefully that will continue spreading. China already is a very large producer of electrolyzers at a very different price point. Perhaps there are doubts that their ways of producing them may not be as carbon efficient as they should be for a catalyst of the green industry. But we believe in that context that this looks very much like other industries, the scale up of which have delivered those synergies, and therefore there isn't much concern, hopefully, around realizing those.
What about when it comes to the cost of transport and bringing that down?
Thank you. Transport is well, it depends where and it depends how. It's slightly trickier. Existing natural gas infrastructure in Europe, so pipelines, could be used through blending for hydrogen for the initial projects in Europe. Obviously, in the region in the Middle East, that may also apply for consumption of hydrogen that currently exists and that are in the vicinity of where production would be. Intercontinental transport, currently contemplated through shipping, is not easy for liquid hydrogen, and that's why people are thinking about whether ammonia could be a better vector. So use hydrogen to produce ammonia. Ammonia could be liquefied at -30 degrees or thereabouts, whereas hydrogen at -250 degrees, and therefore.
And we recently saw the first shipment from Saudi to Japan, didn't we, of that exactly last year?
Correct. So ammonia could be an efficient vector, but of course, to the extent that you're going down the ammonia chain, and then at the other end, you need to crack ammonia to turn it back into hydrogen, that adds cost and infrastructure. Yeah, I mean, the current solutions are few and far in between. Indeed, probably ammonia. One day, perhaps pipelines, as there are pipelines for natural gas and oil linking various countries and continents. If hydrogen could get there, that would be a huge enabler, of course.
Would those pipelines in the existing infrastructure, would that not need to be utilized when it comes to natural gas anyway, for rising natural gas demand? And to facilitate that, obviously with oil, we're not going to see it drop off the charts completely, but it's certainly going to start declining. But with that existing infrastructure, by then will probably be called legacy infrastructure, will it be used to meet the gas demands?
Well, natural gas infrastructure could be converted to hydrogen, and in the initial years, it could also use hydrogen through blending.
It sounds like blending is going to need to be the primary route, though, because the conversion, we already need more infrastructure when it comes to the natural gas side anyway.
That's right. I mean, look, the future of natural gas and the impact of hydrogen on natural gas will need to be seen, right? Hydrogen is emerging. Currently, it hasn't really disrupted existing flows. But the key question is, I guess, can existing infrastructure be converted to hydrogen? We are not at 𝗏𝗏 engineers ourselves, but we are being told that it can. Now, new greenfield infrastructure for hydrogen to be transported in gaseous form, so long pipelines that cross countries and continents, are difficult to implement and agree, and there's regulation and legal arrangements around them, and there's geopolitics around those. Have they been resolved in the context of, for example, natural gas or oil in the past? Yes, they have been resolved. There are pipelines that link
after a few headaches sometimes.
After a few headaches, after sometimes several decades, but those experiences are under our belts and solutions do exist. So you touched upon a very important point there. For green hydrogen, proximity to end users is really important for the low-hanging fruits. And ideally, existing hydrogen consumption is also important to the extent that you have gray hydrogen being consumed in some industries. If you can produce green hydrogen nearby and replace that gray hydrogen by green hydrogen with short infrastructure for transport, that is the starting point, of course. Now, intercontinental strategies for selling Middle Eastern hydrogen, green hydrogen elsewhere in Europe, of course, ammonia is an efficient vector. It is technically feasible. Commercially, it adds costs, but to the extent at the other end you have an ammonia consumer that is under pressure to consume green ammonia as opposed to continuing to produce under the current regime, that could be a good starting point as well. Now, recracking ammonia into hydrogen and the associated infrastructure at the other end would add another layer of cost in the context of having to be competitive. That is something that needs to be addressed. Could it be addressed? Time will tell. We are, of course, optimists, and we also hope that some support schemes may also be realized. But the ambition, certainly, of 𝗏𝗏 is unsubsidized, commercially viable green hydrogen.
Unsubsidized, and that's a very, very critical point, isn't it?
Yeah.
With the fear that the push for green hydrogen to be at cost parity to other renewable elements, and mean that we go back and we loop back to bad habits with subsidies and essentially loop ourselves back into a whole new world of pain that we'll be looking back in 20 years thinking, gosh, now we have to try and reduce subsidies as we're doing now with other energy forms and of course water as well. So that is a huge point. How critical do you think that is to the project?
It is hugely critical because as soon as you start incorporating subsidies, number one, you're vulnerable to criticism from other interest groups that actually you need support from the taxpayer and therefore you need to be contained within certain volumes. Actually, therefore, it's an impediment to scaling up.
Especially for an emerging market, the last thing you need is a wave of criticism in addition to the natural doubt that there always is.
Emerging and developed markets, because obviously public opinion plays a key role in the Western world as well, of course. So that's point number one. Point number two, actually, for green hydrogen to really become competitive, it needs the scale, and therefore it cannot rely on subsidies that keep going up with scale, right? So fundamentally, there's no point in beating around the bush. You're either commercially viable or you're not. And if you are commercially viable, it will be very difficult to resist the deployment of green hydrogen If not, you're going to remain marginal, and hydrogen remaining marginal would also mean that its ability to reach the price points that it needs to will be constrained.
Indeed. You, of course, focus on EMEA. From the Middle East perspective, which you've already touched upon, how do you see the role of national oil companies in that region? And some of them have been very open about their ambitions when it comes to hydrogen and wanting to develop that market as an exporter as well, which you touched on. What do you think the path lies ahead for those national oil companies?
I think their role will be central and significant. I think the large national oil companies in the region have been visionary in embracing the changes in paradigm in terms of energy transition globally, and they've been at the forefront of addressing it through the adoption of new ways and adoption of energy transition, in effect.
And they've supported some of the lowest cost, biggest renewable projects the world has.
Absolutely. So, in fact, they know that it would be counterproductive to approach it very defensively, trying to, let's say, slow down energy transition. And there's also the opportunity to build new industries away from oil at the same time. So renewable energy is one of them. Green hydrogen could be another one. Clearly, the know-how in relation to handling fuels and looking into slightly more complex value chain considerations are things that they can deal with better than most. And they do have strong means of enabling such initiatives as well, by being off-takers or by facilitating frameworks and promoting them and putting them on the market and so on. So
a lot of tried and tested means there.
Say again?
A lot of tried and tested means over the years.
Absolutely. And as you say, I mean, they do have the means, but also they can see that this is, while being a threat to the hydrocarbon industry, it's also an opportunity for the region, and it's an opportunity to diversify away the economies from hydrocarbons and becoming potentially a global champion as a new market emerges globally, right? Having said that, in relation to that, obviously, geographic proximity is important in relation to green hydrogen, and the transport-related topic needs to be addressed. In support of that, though, I think local consumption of green hydrogen will be quite important. If the region could reach critical mass as well as a consumption hub, it would be easier to add on infrastructure towards conquering other markets, but also perhaps articulating more localization-related policies and so on.
Because there's a big focus in the Middle East at the moment about it becoming an exporter, that the word is very, very central to the comments coming out from the leadership as well. So, as you say, perhaps when the domestic side has built up that volume, but it seems that they very much want to be exporting before that maximum is reached on a domestic level. Europe has done so much so far when it comes to hydrogen. It's obviously got the strategy outlined as well, which we're very much already within. Do you see a couple of lessons that the Middle East could harvest from Europe in the ways, obviously they're different regions, they're different policies, they have different energy ecosystems existing and planned, but is there anything that the Middle East can learn from Europe and what it's achieved so far? A question that can be asked of any region really, but we're talking about the Middle East, so.
I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say so. I mean, Europe is constrained by an institutional bureaucracy that needs to articulate in quite a lengthy way policies.
Dot every I and cross every T.
That's correct.
Yeah.
The Middle East can go much faster. The issue, though, is that every country currently, or every region, is looking into energy dependency, is looking into localization, and all of those things are not directly compatible with importing, whether it's import of parts of the value chain or importing of the final product. So that is where Middle East needs to think about what role it wants to play beyond its own regional ambitions more globally if it wants to export. How does it make it compelling for other regions to buy Middle Eastern green hydrogen? I don't have a silver bullet answer today, but that is something that would need to be addressed, because we observe indeed in Europe as well that import of electrolyzers is not necessarily what the core idea is, nor is it the import of green hydrogen, even within the various regions of Europe. And the topic that we're promoting, although it's, that 𝗤𝗿𝗄𝗃 is promoting, although it's commercially viable, is not in full alignment with the entirety of the European continent. Obviously, in Northern Europe, for example, countries have other sources of intermittent renewable energy, offshore wind, for example. They also have perhaps industries, consuming industries, and there may be other options rather than green hydrogen being imported from Southern Europe. That is still playing out in Europe. In the Middle East, I think policy articulation and implementation could be faster tracked than in Europe. Because
at the moment, they're not comparative. Europe does have a much more established hydrogen strategy than the Middle East by far.
True, but also it has a much clearer zero carbon strategy.
Yeah.
So 2050 net zero, EU and most European non-EU countries are in there. The Middle Eastern countries are not really in there. They haven't articulated that commitment at this point. Neither has China nor the US, by the way.
Indeed.
But most other countries around the globe have.
Do you think that they would want to commit to net zero before they carve out a hydrogen plan, or is a hydrogen plan far easier to carve out and launch with the assumption of obviously they have their national vision targets and carbon reduction targets there as well, and sustainability targets, but would it be easier from a social acceptance and on the ground level to have a hydrogen plan before setting out a net zero target? Is net zero just a step too far right now for the Middle East?
A very interesting question. It's quite, it's not something that we usually think about, but now that I think about it, obviously, if you commit to a net zero by 2050, you don't have many options to achieve it. And green hydrogen is an obvious high potential option. And therefore, you would probably embrace green hydrogen
by default
more immediately. Whereas if you tried to keep your option open in relation to 2050 net zero, then maybe if you didn't have the right alignment with what's going on around the world about green hydrogen, you may just hedge your bets and not necessarily invest yourself fully in it. That is the theoretical thoughts I just had about it. But how does it apply here? What is the thinking within the governments? It remains to be seen.
And that's exactly it with this market, is at the moment, a lot of questions outweigh the answers that we have, which makes it so exciting. Thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you very much.